The village of St. Mary Mead had seen its fair share of peculiar events, but nothing quite as perplexing as the case of the silver locket. It all began on a cold autumn morning, when the body of young Beatrice Harborough was discovered in her bedroom at the Willows, her family's grand but aging estate on the outskirts of the village. The cause of death was not immediately obvious. There were no signs of struggle, no visible wounds, and yet the 22-year-old lay lifeless in her bed, as though she had simply drifted away in the night. It was Beatrice's older brother, Alfred, who had raised the alarm. Having returned home late from a business trip, he had gone to check on his sister before retiring for the night. What he found sent a chill through him. Beatrice, still in her nightgown, her eyes half open but unfocused, her hands clutching the folds of her blankets as if she had fallen asleep that way. The doctor's initial examination could not determine a cause of death, and the police, led by the efficient but unimaginative Inspector Craddock, were at a loss. Poison was suspected, but no glass vial or trace of anything suspicious was found in the room. The room itself was undisturbed, the windows locked from the inside, and the doors bolted just as the housekeeper, Mrs. Pembrook, swore they had been the previous evening. Beatrice's jewellery box sat untouched on her vanity, her purse with a small sum of money remained on the bedside table, and nothing seemed to be missing, except for one item noted later by her grieving mother. A silver locket Beatrice always wore, a gift from an unknown admirer, was no longer around her neck. The locket was a point of curiosity. Beatrice had been seen wearing it often, and though she had been rather secretive about it, there had been whispers that it had come from a certain Mr. James Radcliffe, a gentleman from London whom she had met during the summer. It was said that he had visited the Willows only once, and thereafter their communication had continued through letters. No one knew for certain what had become of those letters, nor was Mr. Radcliffe's whereabouts known at present. When news of the strange and unsettling death reached Miss Marple, she felt a familiar stir of curiosity. To an ordinary observer, the case appeared almost too neatly tragic, an unexpected death with no sign of foul play. But experience had taught Miss Marple that such tidy tragedies often concealed far messier truths. And so, when Alfred Harborough himself visited her modest cottage, eyes shadowed with concern, and asked if she might offer her unique perspective, she did not hesitate. The Willows was an impressive house, its ivy-clad walls and tall chimneys lending it an air of faded grandeur. Miss Marple arrived mid-morning, welcomed by a household draped in quiet mourning. She took tea with Mrs. Harborough, a frail woman whose grief was tinged with unease, while Alfred paced near the fireplace. Beatrice's father, Colonel Harborough, had passed away years prior, leaving his widow and children with enough wealth to maintain appearances, but not enough to live extravagantly. She was in perfect health, Mrs. Harborough murmured, her hands trembling around her teacup. "I cannot understand it," Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "A sudden death with no clear cause is most distressing." Her blue eyes flickered with thoughtful intent. "And yet, sometimes the smallest details hold the greatest significance. You mentioned a missing locket?" "Yes," Alfred said, stopping his pacing. "Beatrice never took it off. It was very dear to her, and now it's gone." The fact of the missing locket puzzled Miss Marple greatly. It was not valuable, not in any way that would tempt a common thief. Its absence was not a coincidence. It meant something. And she suspected it was not the only missing piece of this puzzle. Miss Marple sat in the dimly lit drawing-room of the Willows, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. The fire crackled softly in the grate, casting flickering shadows across the elegant yet slightly worn furnishings. She had asked to see Beatrice's room, but before that she wanted to listen, really listen, to those who had last seen the girl alive. In her experience, people often revealed more than they intended when grief and anxiety loosened their tongues. Alfred Harborough remained by the mantelpiece, his arms crossed, jaw tight with tension. His mother, Mrs. Harborough, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, her fingers trembling. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pembrook, stood a little apart, back stiff, lips pressed together as though she disapproved of any unnecessary fuss. It was such an ordinary evening, Mrs. Pembrook finally said, breaking the heavy silence. Miss Beatrice dined with her mother, then retired to her room early. She had been in high spirits earlier, speaking of— She hesitated, her eyes darting toward Alfred. Of what, Mrs. Pembroke? Miss Marple prompted gently. A letter, I believe, the housekeeper admitted, smoothing the front of her apron. She received one that morning. She was quite taken with it, smiling to herself. A letter? Alfred's brow furrowed. I didn't see one among her belongings. Nor did I, Mrs. Harborough added, a faint crease of worry forming on her forehead. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. A missing letter, a missing locket. These were not coincidences. And after dinner, Miss Marple inquired. She retired around 9 o'clock, Mrs. Pembroke said. I saw her go up the stairs myself. When I went to lock the doors later, I noticed the light still on under her door. I assumed she was reading, as she often did. Alfred exhaled sharply. And yet, by morning, he stopped, jaw tightening again. Miss Marple let the silence settle, before asking, Was anyone else in the house last night apart from yourselves? Mrs. Harborough shook her head. Only the staff, Mrs. Pembroke, of course, and young Lily, the maid. But she was in bed before 10. And the gardener. Any visitors? No visitors, Alfred said. As for the gardener Dawson, he only comes during the day. I saw him leave before dusk. Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully. And this locket, you say she never took it off? Never, Mrs. Harborough confirmed. She was quite secretive about it. She never let me open it, though I assumed it contained a lock of hair or a tiny photograph. Miss Marple allowed a thoughtful pause before rising to her feet. I wonder, she said mildly, if I might see Beatrice's room now. Alfred hesitated, but then gestured for her to follow. Of course, this way. The upstairs corridor was quiet, the air heavy with that peculiar stillness that lingers after tragedy. The scent of lavender and old books clung to the fabric of the house, mingling with the faint, sharp scent of something else, something metallic perhaps, or medicinal. Miss Marple took careful note of it. Alfred opened the door to Beatrice's room, and Miss Marple stepped inside. The room was neat, as one would expect of a well-brought-up young lady. The bed covers were slightly rumpled, the lace-trimmed pillow undisturbed. A book rested on the nightstand, open but unread, its pages barely creased. The vanity mirror reflected the soft morning light filtering through lace curtains. Miss Marple moved carefully, her keen eyes taking in every detail. The absence of the locket was obvious, but other things struck her as odd. The drawer of the writing desk was slightly ajar, though Alfred had said they found no letter. Miss Marple bent down, peering closer. There, caught in the seam of the wood, was the faintest trace of torn paper, so small one might have missed. It entirely. She straightened, moving next to the bedside table. She ran a finger over the book's spine, then flipped a few pages back. Something had been slipped between them recently. A faint indentation remained, as though someone had hidden something inside and then removed it. Her gaze then drifted toward the window, locked from the inside, just as reported. And yet, something about the curtain unsettled her. She reached out, brushing her fingers along the fabric. A fine layer of dust coated most of it, except for one section near the edge. That part was disturbingly clean, as though someone had gripped it recently. Alfred, watching her closely, frowned. "What is it?" Miss Marple turned, her expression mild. "Curious," she said. "It seems someone opened these curtains last night, perhaps to look out, or perhaps someone was outside, looking in." Alfred's face darkened. But the house was locked. No one could have come in that way. Miss Marple simply smiled. Perhaps not. But then again, one mustn't assume things too. Quickly. As she turned, her gaze caught something small on the floor near the bedpost. She stooped, retrieving it carefully. It was a tiny, delicate chain link. Silver. She straightened slowly, weighing its significance. The locket was missing. The letter was missing. And now, here was a broken chain. Beatrice had not removed the locket herself. Someone had taken it, and that meant that someone had been here. Miss Marple held the broken silver chain delicately between her fingers, the faint glint of metal catching the soft light from the window. A small thing, so easy to overlook, yet it told her something important. Someone had been in Beatrice's room that night, close enough to have taken the locket. Whether they had come before or after the girl's death remained to be seen. She tucked the broken link into her handkerchief and turned to Alfred. "Would you be so kind as to gather those who were in the house last night? I should like to ask a few questions." Alfred hesitated, but then nodded. "Of course," he said, though his jaw remained set tight. Miss Marple followed him downstairs, where Mrs. Pembrook had taken up her station near the parlour, standing with her hands clasped before her. The housekeeper's face, lined with years of managing the household, remained composed, but there was a flicker of something. Was it defensiveness, as Miss Marple approached? "Lily, the maid, where is she?" Miss Marple asked. "In the kitchen," Mrs. Pembrook answered promptly. "Shall I fetch her?" "Please," Miss Marple said, and while the housekeeper went to summon the girl, she turned her attention back to Alfred. "You mentioned that Beatrice received a letter yesterday morning. Do you recall if she said anything about its contents?" Alfred shook his head. "No, only that she seemed rather pleased. She was humming to herself after breakfast, quite unlike her usual reserved manner. I assumed it was from—" He hesitated. "Well, from Mr. Radcliffe. She was quite taken with him." Miss Marple gave a thoughtful nod. "And yet that letter is nowhere to be found now." Alfred's brow furrowed. "You think it was taken? Letters do not vanish on their own," Miss Marple said mildly. At that moment, Mrs. Pembrook returned with Lily trailing behind her. The girl looked pale, her hands twisting at her apron as she stood in the doorway. She was young, no more than 17, with wide, anxious eyes. "Come in, dear," Miss Marple said kindly, gesturing to a chair. Lily perched on the edge of it, her fingers still wringing the fabric of her uniform. "You were here last night, weren't you?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes, miss," Lily said quickly. I helped clear up after dinner, then went straight to my room. I never heard anything, I swear." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "And this morning, when you heard what had happened, you must have been terribly shocked." The girl nodded, vigorously. "Oh, yes, miss. Terrible shock. Miss Beatrice was always kind to me." Miss Marple let a small pause settle before she continued. "Tell me, my dear, did you see anyone with Miss Beatrice's letter?" Lily's fingers twisted harder at the fabric. No, miss, I don't know nothing about a letter." The slight hesitation did not go unnoticed. "And the locket?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but firm. The girl's breath hitched. "Locket?" "Yes, the silver locket Miss Beatrice always wore. It's missing." Lily's gaze darted toward Mrs. Pembrook, who gave her a sharp look, then quickly back to the floor. I didn't see it, miss," she said, though the tightness in her voice suggested she was holding something back. Miss Marple did not press her just yet. Instead, she turned to Mrs. Pembrook. "Mrs. Pembrook, do you recall what time you retired?" "For the night?" The housekeeper stiffened ever so slightly. "A little after 10, as usual." "And before that? Did you hear anything from Miss Beatrice's room?" Mrs. Pembrook shook her head firmly. "Not a sound." Miss Marple observed her for a long moment. "And yet, Mrs. Pembroke, I find myself curious. If the doors were locked and no one entered from outside, and if Miss Beatrice was alone in her room, how do you suppose her locket came to be missing?" The housekeeper's face remained carefully composed, but there was a flicker in her eyes, something cautious, calculating. "I wouldn't know, miss." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly, but there was a sharpness behind it. "No, I suppose not." She turned back to Lily. "My dear, I wonder if you might do something for me. When you were cleaning yesterday, did you notice anything unusual? A misplaced object? A door left open when it shouldn't have been?" Lily hesitated, again biting her lip. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she said, "Well, the study door, miss. It's always kept shut at night. But when I passed by after clearing the dining table, it was open a crack." Alfred straightened. "The study? That's where my father kept his old papers, but Beatrice never had reason to go in there." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest. "How odd. And did you notice anything inside?" Lily shook her head quickly. "No, miss, I didn't look. I just hurried on to bed." Miss Marple gave a slow nod, her mind turning over this new piece of information. The study, the missing letter, the missing locket, threads in the same tangled knot. Someone had gone into that study last night, and someone was lying. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room of the Willows, the weight of silence pressing down upon her like the autumn fog gathering outside. Every piece of information was beginning to form a pattern, but the lines were still blurred, tangled with deception. The missing locket, the vanished letter, the study door left ajar. These were not meaningless details. They were breadcrumbs leading to the truth. She turned her gaze toward Alfred, who stood rigidly by the fireplace, his hands clenched behind his back. His distress was genuine, but Miss Marple had seen too many cases to accept appearances at face value. He had arrived home late the previous night, yet his own movements remained largely unaccounted for. "Mr. Harborough," she said, her voice gentle yet probing, "might I ask, when precisely did you return home?" Alfred exhaled sharply. "Not until well past midnight. The train from London was delayed." "Did anyone see you arrive?" He hesitated, then gave a slight nod. Dawson, the gardener. He has rooms above the carriage house. I saw a light in his window when I came in. Miss Marple made a mental note to speak to Dawson. And when you entered the house, did anything seem out of place? Alfred frowned. No, everything was quiet. I went straight to bed. And you did not check on your sister immediately? A flicker of guilt passed over his face. No, I didn't want to wake her. I only looked in on her when I came down early this morning. It was reasonable enough, yet Miss Marple had long learned that hesitation often concealed more than people wished to admit. Before she could press further, the sound of footsteps in the corridor drew her attention. Inspector Craddock had arrived. The inspector, a man of solid build and methodical temperament, greeted Miss Marple with a respectful nod. I hear you've been making inquiries, he said, his sharp gaze sweeping over the assembled household. I hope you don't mind if I do the same. Miss Marple smiled. Not in the least, Inspector, though I dare say you'll find the matter quite perplexing. Craddock settled into a chair, producing his notebook. We'll see about that. Now let's talk about motives, shall we? Because right now, this case has more questions than answers. His gaze landed on Mrs. Harborough first. Ma'am, your daughter? Was there anyone who would have reason to harm her? Mrs. Harborough flinched, her fingers tightening around the lace handkerchief in her lap. Harm her? No, no one. Beatrice was well liked. And yet, Miss Marple interjected delicately, there was the matter of the locket and the letter. Might I ask, did you ever meet Mr. Radcliffe, the gentleman Beatrice was corresponding with? Mrs. Harborough's lips pressed together, and Alfred shifted uncomfortably. It was he who answered. No. Beatrice spoke of him often, but he was something of a mystery. She mentioned meeting him during the summer, but after that, their courtship seemed to exist only through letters. Craddock frowned. You say he only visited once? Yes, Alfred confirmed. Months ago, a brief visit, and then nothing. I thought it odd at the time. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And you say you found no recent letters among her belongings? None at all, Alfred said grimly. Craddock tapped his pen against his notebook. So, if someone took that letter, it means they knew what was in it, or at least they believed it was important enough to remove. The room fell into pensive silence. Miss Marple turned her attention back to Mrs. Pembrook. Mrs. Pembrook, forgive me for asking, but did Beatrice have any disputes with the staff? Any signs of trouble? The housekeeper's lips thinned. Certainly not. Miss Beatrice was a lady, kind, proper. If she had grievances, she kept them to herself. And yet, Miss Marple mused, someone knew about that locket, knew it was important enough to take, and that suggests something very particular, knowledge. Someone within this house, someone close enough to Beatrice to be aware of what she valued, took it. A taut silence followed. Lily, the maid, had been standing quietly by the doorway, but now she gave a tiny, involuntary flinch. Miss Marple caught it. My dear, she said gently, do you know something that might help us? Lily's lower lip trembled. She looked at Mrs. Pembrook as though seeking permission, but the housekeeper's stern expression remained unchanged. I don't know, miss, Lily stammered. I saw something strange last night. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, encouraging her. Go on, dear, Lily swallowed. It was late, past 10, I think. I was going up to my room and I saw someone in the corridor, near Miss Beatrice's room. The room tensed. Who was it? Craddock demanded. The girl hesitated, then whispered, Mrs. Pembrook. A sharp intake of breath came from Alfred, and even Mrs. Harborough turned wide eyes toward her housekeeper. But Mrs. Pembrook did not flinch. Instead, she lifted her chin. I was only ensuring the house was in order, she said crisply. A duty I have performed for 20 years. And yet, Miss Marple said softly, you failed to mention it earlier. The housekeeper's fingers twitched, but she did not respond. Craddock frowned. Why were you near Miss Beatrice's room? A pause, then measuredly. I thought I heard something. Miss Marple's keen eyes observed her. And did you? Mrs. Pembroke exhaled, her composure cracking ever so slightly. Perhaps. A sound, a rustling, like paper. But when I stood outside the door, all was quiet. I thought I must have imagined it. Craddock made a note. That's rather convenient, Mrs. Pembroke. And yet a letter is missing. Do you expect us to believe you heard nothing more? I expect you to believe the truth, she said stiffly. Miss Marple studied her, then turned her attention back to Lily. And you, my dear, did you see her enter the room? Lily shook her head. No, miss. Just standing there, listening. Miss Marple folded her hands. Inspector, if I may suggest, it might be worth checking Mrs. Pembroke's quarters. If the letter is hidden anywhere, it is likely within this house. Mrs. Pembroke's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Craddock rose. I believe you're right, Miss Marple. He looked at Alfred. Mr. Harborough, will you show me to the housekeeper's quarters? Alfred hesitated only a moment before nodding. Miss Marple remained seated as they left the room, her mind weaving together the threads of motive and opportunity. The letter, the locket, the midnight rustling of paper, each pointed to hidden truths. She glanced toward Mrs. Harborough, who sat stiffly, her eyes darting anxiously between her hands and the door where the inspector had gone. The poor woman was frightened. Of what precisely Miss Marple did not yet know, but she would. Inspector Craddock returned to the drawing-room an hour later, a grim expression set upon his face. In his hand he held a crumpled envelope, its edges worn and smudged with fingerprints. Mrs. Pembroke followed behind him, her face carefully composed, though a faint tightness around her lips betrayed her displeasure. Miss Marple, who had remained, seated with quiet patience, merely lifted an eyebrow as the inspector placed the envelope on the table before her. Found in Mrs. Pembroke's quarters, Craddock announced, stuffed behind a row of linens in a cupboard. I'd say that's rather damning, wouldn't you? Mrs. Harborough gasped softly, her fingers clenching at her handkerchief. Alfred, standing stiffly by the fireplace, cast a sharp glance at the housekeeper. Lily, who had remained quietly at the back of the room, gave a tiny whimper. Miss Marple, however, was not so easily moved. She picked up the envelope carefully, noting the name written in Beatrice's neat handwriting, Mr. Radcliffe. The paper was creased as if it had been handled repeatedly, and a faint scent of lavender clung to it, perhaps from its time hidden among the linens. Have you read it? She asked. Craddock nodded. Yes. The contents are simple enough. A letter from Beatrice, asking Mr. Radcliffe to meet her in secret, mentioning something important that she had discovered. The date matches last night. He turned to Mrs. Pembroke. Well, madam, care to explain. Mrs. Pembroke lifted her chin, her expression betraying neither guilt nor fear. "I cannot," she said evenly. "I did not take the letter. I have no idea how it came to be in my cupboard." Craddock let out a sharp breath. "That's a convenient answer." Miss Marple, still studying the envelope, did not appear as convinced. "Inspector," she said gently, "perhaps we ought to consider this carefully before rushing to conclusions." Craddock frowned. "You're not suggesting she's innocent?" Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. "Oh no, Inspector. I am merely suggesting that guilt is not always as simple as it appears. Consider this: if Mrs. Pembrook had truly taken the letter, why would she keep it in her own quarters? Why not destroy it, or dispose of it somewhere far from suspicion?" Craddock hesitated. "Perhaps she meant to return it, or panicked and hid it without thinking." "Perhaps," Miss Marple allowed. "And yet I find it rather interesting that the letter was hidden among linens, a place unlikely to be searched unless one knew precisely where to look." She set the letter down. "Which raises another question. Who knew where to find it?" The room fell into heavy silence. Mrs. Pembrook's jaw tightened, but her eyes flicked briefly toward Lily. The movement was slight, but Miss Marple caught it. "And what of the locket?" Alfred spoke up, his voice clipped. "You found the letter, but my sister's locket is still missing. Doesn't that suggest another culprit?" Craddock, however, seemed satisfied with the discovery. "A letter arranging. A secret meeting, a housekeeper found concealing it. I'd say we have enough to act on." Miss Marple sighed inwardly. The authorities, in their usual manner, were always eager to wrap a case neatly. But neatness did not always mean truth. Craddock gestured toward Mrs. Pembrook. "For now, I have no choice but to consider you a suspect, madam. You'll remain in the house under watch until we sort this out." The housekeeper's expression remained impassive, but Miss Marple could see the way her fingers tightened at her sides. As the inspector stepped away to give instructions to his officers, Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Pembrook. "I imagine this is rather frustrating for you." "Infuriating," the housekeeper replied coolly. "And yet you do not protest." Mrs. Pembrook's gaze was sharp. "Would it matter if I did?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Perhaps not to the inspector. But to me? Oh, yes." The housekeeper studied her for a moment before giving a small sigh. "I did not take the letter, Miss Marple, nor did I harm Miss Beatrice. Whatever she discovered, it was not I who wished to keep it hidden." Miss Marple nodded, satisfied for now. The matter, at least in the eyes of the authorities, appeared settled. The house quieted as the weight of an impending resolution settled over it. But Miss Marple could not ignore the nagging feeling in the back of her mind. Something was wrong. She had seen it before: the rush to judgment, the eagerness to claim a case solved before all the pieces fit. And this case, she knew, was far from solved. As night fell, a hush fell over the Willows. The storm from earlier had passed, leaving only a thick fog rolling across the grounds. Miss Marple sat in her room, staring at the silver chain she had found. The locket was still missing, the letter too easily discovered, and the real murderer still out there, still waiting. The fog curled around the estate like silent fingers, muting the world beyond the great house. Miss Marple sat in her room, her fingers tracing the fine silver chain she had found, the locket still missing but its significance undeniable. Something was wrong. Something about the case did not settle neatly, no matter how much Inspector Craddock seemed eager to believe. It did. Mrs. Pembrook might be secretive, but she was no fool. And hiding the letter in her own quarters? That was far too careless for a woman of her experience. No, it had been planted there. Someone wanted to direct suspicion onto her. But why? She placed the chain carefully on the nightstand and rose, peering out through the misted window. The willows stood in eerie silence, the past pressing upon it like a weight. And that, she realized, was the key. This crime was not just about the present. It was about something older, something long buried. Her mind flickered back to an old case, one she had read about years ago in the local papers. A young woman had vanished in much the same way Beatrice had. No sign of struggle, no clear suspect, only whispers of a love affair gone wrong. That woman, too, had possessed a distinctive silver locket. The details were hazy, but Miss Marple never forgot a crime once she had studied it. And now, an old suspicion crept into her thoughts. The past always had a way of leaving its mark. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Slipping her shawl over her shoulders, she moved swiftly down the corridor, her steps silent against the old wooden floors. The household had settled into uneasy quiet, most of them retiring early under the heavy weight of the day's accusations. But one person had not gone to bed. A faint creak betrayed movement downstairs. Miss Marple followed the sound, pausing near the staircase where the glow of a lantern flickered through the dimness. Someone was in the study. She stepped carefully forward and saw Alfred Harborough standing by his father's old desk, rifling through a drawer with shaking hands. "Looking for something, Mr. Harborough?" she asked softly. He stiffened, his fingers tightening around whatever he had found. Then slowly he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Miss Marple, I thought everyone had retired," she smiled, gently. "Most have. But I find that the most interesting things often happen when people believe they are unobserved." His jaw clenched. "I was merely going through some old records. Family matters." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Old records, or something specific to Beatrice?" Alfred's nostrils flared slightly, but he did not answer. She stepped further into the room, her keen gaze falling upon the item in his grip. A folded sheet of yellowed paper, its edges worn with age. "Might I see what you found?" He hesitated. Then, with a sigh, he handed it to her. "It's an old letter, from my father, to a woman named Eleanor Radcliffe." The name struck like a bell in Miss Marple's mind. Eleanor Radcliffe. That was the name from the old case, the woman who had vanished all those years ago. She unfolded the letter carefully, scanning the elegant script. The words were brief, but their meaning was undeniable. "Eleanor, I cannot protect you if you insist on returning. The past must remain buried. I beg you, for your own sake, do not come back to the Willows." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Your father wrote this?" Alfred nodded. "It was among his private papers. I never knew about it until now." She glanced at him, her mind racing. "And you believe this Eleanor Radcliffe is connected to Beatrice's disappearance?" Alfred hesitated, his expression troubled. "I don't know. But something has always haunted this house. My father was a good man, but he kept secrets. I wonder now if Beatrice discovered something she wasn't meant to." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the letter. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, one that stretched far beyond a single night's crime. She turned to Alfred. "Tell me, Mr. Harborough, do you recall anything else about Eleanor Radcliffe?" He frowned. "Very little. She was never spoken of." But there was a story whispered among the servants when I was a boy, that she had loved my father, and that one night she disappeared. My mother forbade any mention of her name. Miss Marple nodded. And yet she had a son. Alfred's eyes widened. You mean? Yes, Miss Marple said softly. Mr. Radcliffe, the man Beatrice was corresponding with, may not have been a stranger after all. If he is the son of Eleanor Radcliffe, then this case is not about a missing locket or a secret romance. It is about unfinished business, and perhaps, she added, about revenge. A deep silence settled between them. Then, from somewhere beyond the study, a sound shattered the stillness. A single muffled cry quickly cut off. Miss Marple and Alfred exchanged a look. Then, without another word, they moved toward the source. Miss Marple moved swiftly, despite her age, following the sound through the dimly lit corridors of the willows. Alfred was close behind her, his breath shallow, his nerves on edge. The muffled cry had come from somewhere near the servants' quarters, a part of the house long shrouded in silence since Beatrice's disappearance. As they neared the hallway, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Lily, the maid, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly at her chest. She flinched as she saw them, her eyes darting nervously between them and the doorway behind her. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "My dear, whatever is the matter?" Lily hesitated, then glanced behind her. I heard something," she whispered, "from inside Mrs. Pembroke's room." Alfred stepped forward, but Miss Marple held up a hand. "Best to be cautious," she murmured. Then gently, she knocked on the door. There was no response. A tense silence settled over them until at last Miss Marple turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of a candle flickering on the bedside table. Mrs. Pembroke sat rigidly on the edge of the bed, her hands gripping her skirts. Miss Marple immediately saw what had startled Lily. A single strand of silver. Chain was dangling from the housekeeper's fingers, the missing locket now in her possession. Craddock had searched the room before. How had it appeared now? Mrs. Pembroke lifted her gaze, her voice low and steady. "I found it in my pillowcase," she said. "Someone placed it there, hoping I would be discovered with it." Miss Marple exhaled softly. The deception was crude, yet effective. Another attempt to frame the housekeeper. But something about this trick felt desperate, as though the true culprit were growing reckless. She studied Mrs. Pembroke carefully, then turned to Lily. The girl was still trembling, shifting, her weight anxiously from one foot to the other. Miss Marple stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Lily, my dear, I wonder if you might assist me with something rather peculiar." The girl blinked, startled. "Me, miss?" "Yes," Miss Marple said with a reassuring smile. "I need to test a theory, and you may be just the person to help." Lily swallowed, then nodded hesitantly. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Pembroke. "Would you mind placing the locket on the table?" The housekeeper obeyed, setting it carefully on the wooden surface. The candlelight flickered across its delicate design, the initials barely visible in the dim glow. Miss Marple then gestured toward Lily. "My dear, I want you to pretend you've just found it. Pick it up, examine it, react as you naturally would." Lily hesitated, confused by the request, but she obeyed. She reached out, lifting the locket between her fingers. Her eyes widened slightly and she gasped softly. "It's real silver," she murmured. Miss Marple watched closely. "Indeed it is. Now tell me, Lily," Have you ever seen it before? Lily frowned. Not before all this happened. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, then turned to Alfred. Would you do the same, Mr. Harborough? Alfred looked surprised but stepped forward, picking up the locket and turning it in his hand. His reaction was different, more measured. He studied it intently, his brows drawing together in concentration. Miss Marple smiled, then turned to, Mrs. Pembrook. And you, my dear, the housekeeper exhaled sharply. I should think I've had quite enough interaction with the wretched thing. Miss Marple chuckled softly, then turned to the final figure standing in the doorway. And you, Inspector? Craddock, who had entered unnoticed, crossed his arms. You've something in mind, Miss Marple? She smiled. Always, my dear Inspector. Just indulge me. With a slight grumble, Craddock stepped forward, took the locket in his large hands, and peered at it. Humph. Nothing particularly remarkable, though I dare say it's important to someone. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Exactly. Inspector, she turned back to the group, her expression bright with satisfaction. You see, my little experiment was quite simple. Everyone reacted differently. Lily was surprised, Mr. Harborough was analytical, Mrs. Pembrook was resigned, and you, Inspector, were pragmatic. But there is one person in this house who would not react that way. A pause settled over the room. Because, Miss Marple continued, to the true culprit this locket is not just an object. It is a symbol of everything they have been trying to hide. She turned suddenly, her eyes locking onto Lily. The girl flinched. Lily, my dear, Miss Marple said gently. I do believe you've seen this locket before, not just recently, not just in passing, but a long, long time ago. Lily's lower lip trembled. No, miss, I swear I haven't. Miss Marple shook her head, her voice still soft but firm. Lying will do you no good, my dear. You see, when you picked up the locket you reacted as though it were new to you. But the way you held it, the way your fingers traced the design so instinctively, that was not the touch of someone unfamiliar with it. It was the touch of someone who has handled it many times before. Lily let out a choked breath. Miss Marple took a step closer. You know what this means, don't you? Tears welled in Lily's eyes. She shook her head violently. No, I don't know anything. Alfred frowned. Miss Marple, what are you suggesting? Miss Marple did not look away from the trembling girl. I am suggesting, Mr. Harborough, that Lily's past is tied to this locket. And if we are to find the truth about what happened to Beatrice, we must first uncover what she has been hiding all along. Lily took a staggering step backward. I didn't mean... Miss Marple's voice remained kind but insistent. Then tell us, my dear. Tell us the truth. The girl hesitated for only a moment longer. Then, with a soft sob, she finally spoke. Lily's sobs came in uneven gasps, her small frame trembling as she clutched the edge of her apron. The candlelight flickered, casting wavering shadows along the walls of the dimly lit room. Miss Marple remained silent, allowing the girl a moment to compose herself. The others stood frozen, waiting. I didn't mean to keep it a secret, Lily finally choked out. I didn't think it mattered anymore. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. The truth always matters, my dear. Lily swallowed hard, her gaze darting toward the locket that still lay on the table. I saw it once before, a long time ago, when I was little. She hesitated, then added in a whisper, My mother had one just like it. A sharp breath cut through the room. Alfred Harborough shifted uneasily, his brows furrowed in confusion. Inspector Craddock straightened, his sharp gaze fixed on Lily. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Your mother, dear? Tell me, was she connected to this house?" Lily gave a tiny nod. "She worked here, as a maid, years before I was born." Mrs. Pembrook stiffened. "What was her name?" Lily bit her lip, hesitant. "Eleanor. Eleanor Carter." A silence fell over them, thick with realization. Mrs. Pembroke's face paled. Even Alfred, who had been largely composed until now, looked startled. Miss Marple, however, merely sighed, as though she had expected this answer. "Eleanor Carter." "Of course," Craddock frowned. "I assume this is significant?" Miss Marple nodded. "Eleanor Carter was involved in a rather tragic affair, Inspector. She was dismissed from the Willows under difficult circumstances." Lily's hands clenched into fists. "She never told me what happened, only that she had to leave." Mrs. Pembroke's voice was barely above a whisper. "She was accused of theft." Lily jerked her head up. "That's a lie!" Miss Marple gently raised a hand. "I do not believe it was ever proven. However, it did lead to her dismissal. And now we find a locket, one that resembles something from your mother's past, at the center of this case." Lily's breath came in shallow gasps. "But what does that mean?" Miss Marple's blue eyes glimmered. "It means, my dear, that this mystery began long before Beatrice was ever involved. The roots of it go deeper than we imagined." Before another word could be spoken, a sharp noise rang through the house, a loud crash from somewhere beyond the room, the sound of something shattering. Inspector Craddock moved first, his instincts kicking in. "Stay here." He strode toward the doorway, his heavy steps echoing through the hall. Miss Marple followed, quick for her age, her mind already leaping to conclusions. Something had just happened. Something or someone was trying to bury the truth before they could unearth. The disturbance led them to the study. The door was ajar, the flickering glow of the fireplace barely illuminating the space. Craddock stepped inside first, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. Miss Marple took in the scene at once. The glass-fronted cabinet that had housed family records and documents was now smashed, shards of glass littering the floor. The scent of ink lingered in the air, as though papers had been handled hastily. Craddock swore under his breath. "Damn it! Someone's been here." Miss Marple stepped closer, her sharp eyes scanning the wreckage. "Not just been here, Inspector. They've taken something." Alfred appeared in the doorway, followed closely by Mrs. Pembrook and Lily. "What's happened?" Alfred asked, his expression darkening as he surveyed the damage. Craddock gritted his teeth. "Someone broke into the cabinet." Mrs. Pembroke's face drained of colour. "The Pembroke records." Miss Marple turned to her. "Were there personal documents inside?" Mrs. Pembroke nodded. "Old letters, wills, family records from decades ago." She pressed a trembling hand to her chest. "What's missing?" Craddock crouched, sifting through the mess with careful hands. After a moment he exhaled sharply and held up an empty leather folder. "This." Miss Marple's lips pursed. A missing folder. Curious indeed. Lily stepped forward hesitantly. What was inside? Mrs. Pembroke looked stricken. The employment records. They were kept in that folder, dating back to the time when Eleanor Carter worked here. A Slow, heavy silence settled over the room. Miss Marple's voice was almost a whisper. Then someone is working very hard to erase the past. Craddock rose to his full height, his jaw set. We're dealing with someone who isn't just covering up Beatrice's disappearance. They're covering up something far older. And they're willing to destroy evidence to do it. Alfred's expression darkened. Who would have access to the study? Mrs. Pembrook shook her head. Not many people. The house staff rarely enters. The key was kept in my possession. But it's missing now. Miss Marple turned to Lily. My dear, is there anything else about your mother's time here that you remember? Lily hesitated, then slowly shook her head. Only that she never spoke of it, and she never came back. Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against the arm of a nearby chair. Which means whatever happened to Eleanor Carter was enough to make her stay silent for the rest of her life. Craddock exhaled sharply. Someone didn't want us connecting Eleanor Carter to this case, and now we may never know what those records contained. Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. Oh, but we will, Inspector, Craddock frowned. How? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet confidence. Because, my dear Inspector, criminals are often quite thorough in their efforts to cover their tracks, but in their desperation, they always leave something behind. She turned to the others, her gaze lingering on each of them in turn. The real question is, who among us is afraid of what we might find? A sharp gust of wind rattled the window panes as Miss Marple sat in the dimly lit drawing room, her knitting needles resting motionless in her lap. The weight of the evening's events pressed heavily upon her. Someone had destroyed those records with clear intent, wiping away a key link to Eleanor Carter's past. But the act was too desperate, too hasty. Whoever had done it was losing control. And when people panicked, they made mistakes. Inspector Craddock stood near the hearth, arms crossed, deep in thought. We should station an officer outside, he muttered. If someone's willing to break in to cover their tracks, they may go further. Miss Marple gave a small nod, though her mind was elsewhere. It wasn't merely about covering tracks. It was about control. The person behind this was trying to steer the investigation, to mislead, to obscure, to frighten, and that meant a piercing scream cut through the silence. Lily Craddock was the first to move, dashing toward the corridor, Miss Marple close behind. The others spilled out from their rooms, alarmed, drawn toward the sound of the girl's terror. They found Lily at the foot of the stairs, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. And at the top of the landing, a body lay sprawled. Across the carpet, Alfred Harborough. Miss Marple's sharp intake of breath was drowned out by the others. Craddock rushed up the steps, kneeling beside the unmoving form. Alfred's eyes were closed, his face ghostly pale. Blood seeped from a gash on his temple, pooling against the rich blue of the carpet. Mrs. Pembrook clutched the banister, shaking, her head in disbelief. No, this can't be. Craddock pressed 2 fingers against Alfred's neck. A tense pause, then he exhaled sharply. He's alive, barely. A collective gasp of relief mixed with unease. Miss Marple moved carefully, her sharp gaze sweeping the landing. The scene was troubling. The position of his body, the nature of the injury, it didn't look like an accident. He was attacked, she said quietly. Lily let out a choked sob. I heard a noise. I came out of my room and saw him there. Craddock's expression darkened. The attacker must still be in the house. He stood abruptly, scanning the faces around him. No. One leaves. We search every room. As officers were summoned and the house was combed through, Miss Marple lingered beside Alfred. His breathing was shallow, his skin clammy. She had no doubt that whoever had done this had intended to kill. But something had interrupted them. A noise, a sudden disturbance, or perhaps hesitation. A glint of metal near his hand caught her eye. The faintest outline of something small, tucked between his fingers. A watch chain. Miss Marple carefully pried it loose, her breath catching as she turned it in the dim light. A silver locket, not the same one from earlier. This one was older, more worn, but unmistakable. A piece of the past, clutched in the hand of a man who should not have had it. Craddock returned, his frustration evident. No sign of forced entry, no one unaccounted for. Miss Marple held up the locket. Then we are dealing with someone who never needed to enter at all. Craddock frowned. Where did you find that? She gestured toward Alfred's limp hand. It was in his grasp. A fresh silence fell over them. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Pembrook. You recognize the other locket, but do you know this one? Mrs. Pembroke's face was unreadable, but her silence spoke volumes. Miss Marple exhaled softly. I believe. We are closer than ever, Inspector. But our culprit is growing desperate, and desperate people become dangerous. Craddock set his jaw. Then we need to end this, before they strike again. Miss Marple turned the silver locket over in her palm, its tarnished surface glinting faintly in the dim light. It was old, far older than the one Eleanor had worn, and well worn, as if handled often. Alfred Harborough had clutched it in his final conscious moments, as though grasping a truth he had only just realized. That, Miss Marple knew, was no coincidence. Inspector Craddock, still fuming from the fruitless search, rubbed a hand across his forehead. This locket again, he muttered. First Eleanor's, now this. We've been chasing it like a ghost. Miss Marple gave a small hum, her fingers tracing the delicate hinge. Not quite a ghost, Inspector. More like a thread. And threads, when pulled, tend to unravel the whole tapestry. The quiet murmur of the household filled the corridor, whispers of worry, the occasional sniffle from Lily, Mrs. Pembroke's subdued fretting. And yet, beneath it all, something had begun to shift. The tension in the air was different now. The attacker had struck in haste, expecting Alfred to die, but he had survived, and that meant they had failed, which also meant they were afraid. She glanced at the others. The Pembrokes, standing close together. Eleanor, pale but watchful. Lily, still trembling. Every one of them had a role to play in this tangled story. But which of them had stepped out of the shadows tonight? Craddock sighed, motioning for the constable. Get Harborough to the hospital under guard. I want a full statement the moment he's able to speak. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the unconscious man. Would he remember? Or had the truth already slipped through his fingers, lost before it could be spoken aloud? As the constable moved to carry out orders, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the locket. With careful fingers she pried it open. Inside, a faded photograph. A woman. She was young, smiling softly, hair neatly arranged, eyes bright. But time had worn the image, blurring the details, Miss Marple's heart gave a small jolt. She had seen this face before. Not in person, no, but somewhere, long ago. Mrs. Pembrook made a strangled sound. "Where did you find that?" Miss Marple lifted her eyes. The woman's hand trembled against the banister. "You recognize her," Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Pembrook hesitated, then shook her head too quickly. "No, it's just—" But the words failed her. And in that moment, Miss Marple saw the truth. Not the full picture, no, not yet, but a shape in the fog, just starting to take form. She turned to Eleanor. "My dear, when you first arrived here, you said something that struck me as rather odd. You mentioned that you'd received a letter urging you to come, that it seemed almost urgent." Eleanor nodded warily. "Yes, from my aunt's solicitor. He said there was something she wanted me to have, something important." Miss Marple held up the locket. "And yet, your aunt had already given you one that was meant for you and you alone." Eleanor blinked. "Yes, but I don't understand." Miss Marple's lips pressed together in thought. Two lockets, two pieces of the past, and Alfred, the man who had kept silent for so long, had reached for one in his final moments. Craddock exhaled sharply. "Miss Marple, if you have something, now's the time." Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but inside her mind was weaving connections at a rapid pace. The fire that had destroyed Eleanor's records, the silver locket clutched in Alfred's hand, a face in a photograph, recognized yet denied. And a murder, no, two murders now, all tied to a single family estate. She turned to Craddock. "Inspector, do you recall what I said earlier? About the nature of deception?" Craddock's brow furrowed. "That people hide things in plain sight," Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, and that sometimes the thing most visible is the thing most ignored." She turned the locket over once more before tucking it into her palm. A pattern had begun to emerge, faint but undeniable. Someone had spent years weaving a story of their own, and it was about to unravel. Miss Marple closed her fingers over the locket, feeling its weight in her palm. The past had finally begun to bleed into the present, revealing the shape of a long-buried truth. And yet something still eluded her, a final piece of the puzzle, the unspoken reason that had driven someone to murder, the why Mrs. Pembroke's reaction to the photograph had been telling, a flicker of recognition she had tried, and failed, to suppress. But what was it she had seen? The woman in the picture was no stranger, that much was certain. And if Miss Marple was right, neither was the locket itself. The house had grown quiet in the aftermath of the attack, but the silence was not one of peace. It was waiting, tense and uncertain, as if the very walls held their breath. The assailant had failed to kill Alfred Harborough, but they would not stop now. They couldn't. Miss Marple turned to Eleanor, her voice gentle but firm. "My dear, tell me again about your aunt. Not just how she was in her final days, but before that, before you came here." Eleanor hesitated. I don't know much. I hardly knew her at all. She was always distant, almost cold. I used to wonder if she even wanted me here. But then there was the locket and the letter. It was as if she'd changed her mind at the very last moment. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, a deathbed decision, when the weight of old secrets becomes too much to bear." She glanced once more at Mrs. Pembroke, who stood rigid, her hands clasped tightly before her. There was something unnatural about her silence now, the way she held herself apart from the rest. She had been the one to care for Eleanor's aunt in her final days, the one who had stayed by her side. If the old woman had decided to reveal something at the very end, Mrs. Pembrook would have been the first to know. "Mrs. Pembrook," Miss Marple said mildly, "do you recall the night before Eleanor's aunt passed? Did she say anything unusual?" The housekeeper's lips pressed together. "No," she said quickly. "Nothing." But her eyes flickered, betraying her. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Strange, then, that she should have arranged for that letter to be sent. A pause. A small, shuddering breath. Perhaps she felt guilty. Or, Miss Marple said, tilting her head, perhaps she was afraid. The words hung in the air, and in the space between them, the truth pressed forward. Mrs. Pembroke's composure wavered, just for a moment. Then she drew herself up. "I don't know what you mean." But Miss Marple did know, and so she spoke carefully, piecing the threads together as she went. "There were 2 lockets," she murmured. "One meant for Eleanor, and one meant to remain hidden. But Alfred Harborough found it, didn't he? That's why he was attacked. He was silenced before he could say what he had realized." Mrs. Pembroke's breath came sharp. Miss Marple continued, "The woman in this photograph, I believe she is the key to all of this." She turned to Eleanor, watching the younger woman's face. "My dear, do you see any resemblance? Look closely." Eleanor leaned in, studying the faded image. She frowned, lips parting slightly. I don't know. Her eyes, maybe. They look a little like..." Her breath caught. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, they look like yours." A stillness fell over the room. Eleanor swallowed hard. "Are you saying?" Miss Marple exhaled. "I believe this woman was not just someone from your aunt's past. I believe she was your mother." A strangled sound escaped Mrs. Pembroke's throat. Eleanor's expression crumpled. "But my mother died when I was a baby. My father told me, yes," Miss Marple said softly, "that she died. But what if that wasn't the whole truth?" Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. "Then why? Why would my aunt—" "Never tell me." Miss Marple turned her gaze to Mrs. Pembroke. "Because someone made certain she never could." The housekeeper's face was pale now, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her dress. "You don't understand," she whispered. Miss Marple studied her carefully. "Then help us understand." Mrs. Pembroke let out a shaking breath, her posture stiff as though she were holding something back with sheer will alone. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then finally, "I did it for the family," she murmured. The room seemed to constrict. Mrs. Pembroke's eyes glistened. "You don't know what it was like. She was reckless, that girl. She ruined everything. She ran away, and when she came back, she was different. She had a child, no husband, no explanation. It was a scandal, a disgrace." Eleanor's hands clenched. "So what?" she whispered. "So what if she had me?" Mrs. Pembroke's expression was raw, tormented. She was going to take everything. The estate, the inheritance. She was the rightful heir. And with her back, they couldn't. Ignore it. But she didn't deserve it, not after what she'd done. The family had worked too hard to be ruined by her choices. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "So what happened?" Mrs. Pembroke swallowed hard. "She had to go. They told her to leave, but she wouldn't, and then—" She faltered. Miss Marple finished the sentence for her. "She died. The older—" Woman closed her eyes. "It was an accident." Miss Marple's expression didn't change. "Was it?" Mrs. Pembroke opened her mouth, then closed it again. Eleanor's voice broke. "And my aunt? She knew?" Mrs. Pembroke looked at her, her expression crumbling. She didn't want to believe it. But she knew. She always knew. A long silence stretched between them. Miss Marple exhaled. "And now she is gone. And someone has been willing to kill to keep that truth buried." Mrs. Pembroke flinched. Inspector Craddock stepped forward, his tone sharp. "Mrs. Pembroke, who else knew?" But Miss Marple already had the answer. The person who had destroyed the records, the person who had attacked Alfred Harborough, the person who had killed to keep the past from coming to light. And now, they were running out of time. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room, her hands folded, neatly in her lap. Outside, the wind howled against the old manor, rattling the window panes. Inside, a different kind of storm brewed. The weight of secrets, of lives lost and lies spun, pressed upon the house like an invisible force. And soon it would all come crashing down. She had asked for everyone to be gathered: Eleanor, Inspector Craddock, Mrs. Pembroke, and most importantly, the one person who had the most to lose when the truth finally emerged. The murderer. Inspector. Craddock stood near the fireplace, his eyes scanning the room warily. He had come to trust Miss Marple's instincts, and though he had his own theories, he knew better than to interrupt when she was about to lay the final pieces of the puzzle in place. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm as she began. "I must say it has been a most troubling case. A young woman brought to a house she had never truly known, an attack on a man who had seen something he should not have, and a crime rooted not in the present, but in a tragedy long past." She looked at Eleanor, who sat pale and rigid in her chair. "My dear, you were told your mother had died when you were a baby, that she had simply vanished from your life, and that nothing could be done to bring her back." A pause. "But that was not true, was it?" Eleanor swallowed hard. "No." Miss Marple nodded. "She did not die naturally. She was made to disappear. Someone saw her as a threat, someone who believed her existence would ruin everything. And that same someone has been watching ever since, waiting, dreading the moment when the past might rise from the grave." Mrs. Pembroke shifted, uneasily. "I told you "You did what you were told," Miss Marple interjected smoothly. "But you were not the one making the decisions, were you?" Mrs. Pembroke's lips parted, but she said nothing. Miss Marple turned her attention to the far side of the room. A figure sat stiffly, hands clasped in their lap, their face carefully composed. They had played their role well, concerned, cooperative, even shocked by the violence that had unfolded around them. But there had been something else, a miscalculation, a single mistake. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Mr. Oliver Pembroke." A silence fell over the room. The man barely moved, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a tightening of his jaw. "I had wondered at first why you seemed so personally invested in this matter. You were always present, always listening, and yet you claimed to know so little. And yet, as I examined everything that had happened, I realized that someone had been working very hard to make sure the past stayed buried. Inspector Craddock stepped forward slightly, watching Pembroke closely. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "the locket was meant to remain hidden. You must have known that Eleanor's aunt had kept it, that it was the last remaining proof of the truth. When Alfred Harborough found it, you panicked. He had to be silenced before he could say what. He had realized that Eleanor was not merely a distant relative taken in out of pity, but the direct heir, the child of the woman whose very existence you had erased." Pembroke's fingers twitched. "This is nonsense." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, it is the truth. When the records disappeared, I knew it was the work of someone who had access, someone who could easily slip through this house unnoticed. And then, when the attack on Alfred Harborough failed, you realized the danger was far from over. Someone had begun asking questions. Me." A muscle in Pembroke's cheek jumped. Miss Marple's voice softened. "It was you who killed Eleanor's mother, wasn't it?" A sharp intake of breath. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. Pembroke remained still. "I don't know what you're talking about." "But you do," Miss Marple said quietly. "You were young then, but ambitious. The estate was not meant for you, was it?" "No, it was meant for her. And when she returned, a child in tow, you saw it all slipping away. So you ensured that she would never claim it. And when Eleanor came back," Pembroke rose to his feet abruptly. "You have no proof," he snapped. Miss Marple met his gaze, calmly. "No? Then why were you so desperate to keep her from discovering the truth?" The wind battered against the windows. Inside, the tension was thick as smoke. Pembroke's breath came fast. "It was an accident," he muttered. "She fell. I didn't mean to—" Eleanor's breath hitched. Miss Marple sighed. "Ah. But then, why did you make sure no one ever found her? Why the deception, the stolen records, the murders?" Pembroke's expression twisted. "Because she was weak. She was reckless. She was ruining everything my father built. She should never have come back." Eleanor stood abruptly. "You killed my mother." Her voice trembled with fury. "And then you tried to kill anyone who got in your way." Pembroke's eyes darted between them, his breathing ragged. "You weren't supposed to be here," he muttered. "You weren't supposed to—" And then he moved. A sudden, desperate motion toward the fireplace, where a heavy iron poker rested against the stone. Inspector Craddock was faster. He seized Pembroke by the arm, twisting it behind his back with practiced efficiency. Pembroke struggled for a moment, before sagging, all fight leaving him. Miss Marple exhaled. "Quite so," she murmured. Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. Craddock tightened his grip on Pembroke. "Oliver Pembroke, I'm placing you under arrest for the murders of Eleanor's mother and—" Pembroke let out a ragged breath, his shoulders slumping. "She should never have come back," he muttered again, as if the words could somehow change the past. Miss Marple watched him, her expression unreadable. Outside, the wind began to die down, and in the silence that followed, justice, long overdue, finally settled over the house. As Inspector Craddock tightened the cuffs around Oliver Pembroke's wrists, a heavy silence settled over the room. Eleanor stood trembling, her fingers gripping the back of a chair as if to steady herself. The weight of the truth pressed upon them all. Justice had been served. The past had finally been unearthed. And yet Miss Marple remained still, her sharp blue eyes fixed upon Pembrook, with an expression not of satisfaction, but of quiet contemplation. It was all too neat, too perfect. She turned toward Eleanor, her voice gentle. "My dear, you are quite certain your mother had no allies when she returned here?" Eleanor blinked, startled by the question. I don't know. I was just a baby." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her fingers tracing the lace on her sleeve. "Indeed, and yet it strikes me as rather odd that she would return to a place so filled with danger without some form of support." She turned her gaze back to Pembrook, whose defiance had faded into exhaustion. "Tell me, Mr. Pembrook, did she come alone?" A flicker of something, hesitation, wariness, crossed his face before he schooled it back into impassivity. He said nothing. Inspector Craddock frowned. "Miss Marple, are you suggesting someone else was involved?" "I am merely suggesting that, perhaps, we have overlooked something quite crucial." The room felt suddenly colder. Eleanor's eyes widened. "You mean someone helped him?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "No, my dear. I mean that someone else orchestrated this entire affair." Pembrook let out a hoarse laugh. "Ridiculous. I did it, didn't I? You have your man." Miss Marple studied him with quiet patience. "Yes, you killed Eleanor's mother. Yes, you sought to bury the truth, to keep Eleanor from ever discovering who she truly was. But tell me, Mr. Pembrook, who benefited the most from all of this?" A pause. Craddock's eyes narrowed. "You mean, besides him?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, indeed." She gestured toward Pembrook. "He was sloppy, impulsive, desperate. But the careful removal of records, the manipulation of history, the orchestrated theft of evidence, no, that is the work of someone far more methodical." A breathless stillness filled the air. Then Eleanor's voice broke through, brittle and uncertain. "But who—" Miss Marple turned toward the figure who had been silent all this time. Mrs. Pembrook, the older woman, sat rigid, her hands folded, tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. "Mrs. Pembrook," Miss Marple said quietly, "it was you, wasn't it?" A sharp inhale. Eleanor's breath hitched. "What?" Miss Marple's voice remained calm, but there was a steel beneath the softness. "You were the one who ensured the records were erased. You were the one who tried to frame others, to cast suspicion away from yourself. You were the one who had the most to lose if Eleanor ever claimed her birthright." Mrs. Pembroke's fingers trembled, but she kept her expression schooled into practiced neutrality. "That's absurd. Why would I do such a thing?" "Because you were the one who arranged her mother's return," Miss Marple said. "You lured her back here. You made her believe she was safe, that she could reclaim what was rightfully hers. And when the time came, you let Oliver dirty his hands while you wiped yours clean." Eleanor's mouth parted, but no sound came out. Inspector Craddock took a slow step forward. "Miss Marple, are you saying Mrs. Pembroke was the mastermind?" Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. Consider for a moment her position. She married into this family, but she was never truly part of it. She watched as her husband's fortune dwindled, as the estate struggled under mismanagement. And then one day she learns of Eleanor's mother, a woman with a rightful claim to everything." Her gaze never wavered from Mrs. Pembroke's face. "You must have seen an opportunity, Mrs. Pembroke. If you could manipulate Oliver into eliminating the problem, you could then control the estate yourself. No need to involve the law, no need for scandal. And when Eleanor reappeared, decades later, history repeated itself. You whispered in Oliver's ear, convinced him to act, and when he failed, you took matters into your own hands. Silence. Mrs. Pembroke's chest rose and fell, her composure cracking ever so slightly. "This is nonsense," she murmured. Miss Marple sighed. "I'm afraid not. The final clue, you see, was in the letters." She gestured toward the desk. "The ones we found in the study. They were written not by Eleanor's mother, but to her. And one letter, one very particular letter, bears a striking resemblance to your handwriting." A sharp exhale. Eleanor turned to Mrs. Pembroke, her face pale. You wrote to her?" Mrs. Pembroke swallowed. "It was a trap," Miss Marple finished gently. "You made her believe she had an ally here, that she could return. And when she did, she turned back to Oliver. You made sure she never left." A long, weighted pause. Then slowly Oliver Pembroke began to laugh. It was a dry, mirthless sound, one filled with bitterness. "Clever old woman," he muttered. "Yes, she told me what had to be done. I did it for her." His gaze slid toward Mrs. Pembroke. "And yet here I am, in handcuffs while she plays the victim." Mrs. Pembroke's hands clenched. "You're a fool," she snapped. "You were always a fool. If you had done as I told you, we wouldn't be in this mess." Craddock seized her wrist before she could move. Mrs. Pembroke froze, her breath shallow. Eleanor stared at her in horror. "You—" Miss Marple gave a small sigh. "Oh dear." The last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Craddock tightened his grip. "Mrs. Pembroke, I think you'll be coming with us." She didn't resist. Eleanor, stunned into silence, turned to Miss Marple, searching for something. Comfort, understanding, an explanation for how people she had trusted could have done such terrible things. Miss Marple took her hand gently. "The past is a terrible weight, my dear, but now at last you are free of it." Eleanor let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening around Miss Marple's. Outside, the wind had died completely, leaving only silence. The kind of silence that comes when the truth, no matter how painful, has finally been spoken. As the police led Mrs. Pembroke and Oliver Pembroke out into the cold evening air, Eleanor remained motionless, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The weight of the revelations pressed down on her, suffocating in its enormity. The motherly figure who had raised her, guided her, given her a semblance of family, had, in truth, been the architect of her greatest sorrow. And Oliver, the bitter, resentful cousin she had always tried to avoid, had been nothing more than a pawn, manipulated into murder under the guise of preserving their legacy. Miss Marple, standing beside her, watched with quiet understanding. There was no satisfaction. In moments like these, only the inevitable tide of consequence. The past had been unearthed, the ghosts given voice, but the wounds they left behind would not heal overnight. Inspector Craddock, dusting his hands off as he returned from overseeing the arrests, sighed deeply. "And that, I suppose, is that." Miss Marple gave a small knowing smile. "Oh, my dear Inspector, I fear it is never quite that simple." Craddock frowned. "What do you mean? We have confessions. The evidence speaks for itself." She tilted her head, glancing toward the departing figures. Tell me, have you considered why Oliver finally decided to speak? Why he so readily threw Mrs. Pembrook under the proverbial bus? Craddock hesitated. Guilt, resentment, a sudden stroke of conscience? Miss Marple chuckled softly. Oh no, it was none of those things. Eleanor turned to her, eyes wide, with something like dread. Then... What? Miss Marple let out a thoughtful hum. Survival. A sharp silence fell. Craddock straightened. You mean he planned it? Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. You see, Oliver Pembrook may be a murderer, but he is also a coward. When the noose tightened around his neck, he did what all cowards do. He looked for someone to blame, someone to take the greater fall, and Mrs. Pembrook, who had orchestrated the crime, was the perfect scapegoat. Eleanor's breath hitched, but she was guilty. Miss Marple gave her hand a gentle squeeze. Oh yes, my dear, quite guilty. But that does not mean Oliver is truly willing to face the consequences of his own crimes. Craddock's frown deepened. You think he has something planned? Miss Marple sighed. I suspect so. You must ensure he does not slip through your fingers, Inspector. He has spent his entire life evading responsibility. Do not allow him to do so now. Craddock, looking grim, gave a curt nod. I'll see to it. But Miss Marple, even as she smiled, did not look reassured. She had seen too many clever criminals evade justice, slipping through cracks where no one had thought to look. And Oliver, for all his weakness, had the desperate cunning of a man with nothing left to lose. Eleanor, still shaken, swallowed hard. And Mrs. Pembroke? Miss Marple's expression softened. She will answer for what she has done. Oh, pause. But I dare say her true punishment has already begun. Eleanor frowned, not understanding at first. Then she glanced toward the retreating carriage, where Mrs. Pembroke sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap. For years she had controlled everything, orchestrated every detail of her life with careful precision. But now, at the very end, she had lost everything, her family, her freedom, and most unbearable of all, her control. She had spent decades weaving a web of lies only to find herself tangled in them at last. Justice, Miss Marple had always believed, came in many forms. Craddock exhaled sharply. Well, I suppose this is where we say our goodbyes. He turned to Eleanor, his expression gentler. You'll be all right? Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. I think so. It's a lot to take in, Miss Marple smiled, a warm, reassuring thing. One step at a time, my dear. The past has held you captive for far too long. Now, at last, you are free to decide your own future. Eleanor blinked back sudden tears. Then, before she could overthink, it pulled Miss Marple into a tight embrace. Thank you, she whispered. Miss Marple patted her back fondly. Oh, my dear, it was quite my pleasure. As they parted, Eleanor took a shaky breath, straightened her shoulders, and turned toward the house that was now truly hers. And as Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock made their way down the path, the wind stirred once more, carrying away the last echoes of a mystery long buried. Justice had been served, but whether all the ghosts had been laid to rest, well, that was another matter entirely. As the carriage carrying Mrs. Pembrook and Oliver disappeared down the winding road, Miss Marple stood quietly in the fading light, her sharp eyes lingering on the retreating figures. Justice had been delivered, or so it seemed. But something still whispered at the edge of her mind. a thread left untied, a question unanswered. Eleanor stood beside her, a mix of relief and exhaustion in her features. "It's over now," she murmured, as if trying to convince herself. Miss Marple turned, her expression unreadable. "Yes, my dear. It is. For now." Eleanor frowned. "For now?" Miss Marple smiled, though there was a distant quality to it. "Do you recall what I said earlier? That the past has its way of lingering?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "You think there's something we missed?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she bent down and picked up something from the ground, brushing the dirt away with gloved fingers. A small, delicate object, half buried, as though it had been discarded or dropped in haste. She turned it over in her palm, eyes narrowing, a gold cufflink. Not Oliver's, nor any belonging to the household that she had seen. Craddock, who had been watching her closely, stepped forward. "What have you found?" Miss Marple held it up between her fingers. "A puzzle piece, Inspector." Craddock took it from her, examining the insignia etched into the surface. "I don't recognize this." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And yet it was here, right outside the house, dropped in the commotion perhaps, or left behind long before we arrived." Eleanor shivered. "You think it belongs to someone else?" Miss Marple turned the cufflink over again. "Murder cases have a way of seeming complete before they truly are. We saw the crime, understood the motive, unraveled the deception, but perhaps we were only looking at the picture we were meant to see." Craddock's jaw tightened. "Are you suggesting there was someone else involved?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, Inspector, I am only suggesting that even the most carefully solved cases may still hold their secrets." The wind picked up, rustling the branches, carrying away the last remnants of a storm that had long since passed. The house loomed. Behind them, dark against the sky, its walls holding decades of stories, some told, some forgotten, and perhaps some waiting to be uncovered. Craddock sighed, slipping the cufflink into his pocket. "I suppose I'll be making another inquiry then." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "That would be wise." Eleanor exhaled, turning toward the house where a new chapter of her life awaited. "I don't know if I'll ever truly feel free of it," she admitted softly. Miss Marple touched her arm gently. "One does not simply escape the past, my dear, but one can choose to move forward, step by step." Eleanor met her gaze, and for the first time there was something steady in her expression. "Then I will." Miss Marple smiled. As she and Craddock walked away, the old detective cast one last glance over her shoulder. The case was solved, and yet somewhere in the shadows the story was not quite finished.